January 1943. The war in Europe has been raging for over 3 years. Britain, battered by the Blitz and strangled by German U-boats, desperately needs supplies, food, fuel, ammunition, aircraft parts. Everything. The convoy system was Britain's lifeline. Without these merchant ships making the crossing, Britain couldn't have continued the war. But it was incredibly dangerous. U-boats were sinking ships faster than we could build them. On January 15, 1943, Convoy SC-118 assembled at New York Harbor. 63 merchant ships, carrying everything from grain to gasoline, from steel to aircraft engines. Among them were 5 smaller supply vessels that would later be designated as Convoy Section Charlie, the ships that would become known as the Ghost Convoy. The SS Northern Star, a Liberty ship fresh from the shipyards of Baltimore, carrying aircraft parts and ammunition. The SS Westwood, a tanker loaded with high-octane aviation fuel. The freighter Manchester Belle, her holds packed with steel and machinery. The smaller coastal steamer Atlantic Dream, transporting food supplies. And finally, the Canadian vessel Maple Providence, carrying medical supplies and winter clothing for Allied troops. 5 ships. 217 men. None of them would ever reach Britain. The convoy's commanding officer was Commodore Harold Thompson, a veteran of the First World War and dozens of Atlantic crossings. His flagship was the larger merchant cruiser HMS Wanderer. Thompson had seen his share of action in these waters. He'd watched ships explode. He'd pulled men from burning oil slicks. He knew the odds. But on that cold January morning, as the convoy slipped out of New York Harbor and into the gray Atlantic, Thompson had no reason to suspect that this crossing would be any different from the others. The weather forecast was reasonable. Intelligence reports showed U-boat activity farther south. The convoy had a strong escort, 4 destroyers and 2 corvettes. The men aboard the 5 supply ships were mostly merchant seamen, not military personnel. Many were veterans of previous crossings. Some were making their first voyage across the Atlantic. They came from all over: New York dockers, farm boys from the Midwest, Canadians from Nova Scotia, a few British sailors who'd survived previous sinkings and somehow found themselves heading back across the same deadly waters. On the Northern Star, Chief Engineer Tom Bradley wrote a letter to his wife in Boston. "Another milk run," he called it. "Should be back by Valentine's Day with stories and maybe some English tea if I can find any." That letter would be found months later in his locker, unstamped, unsent. Tom Bradley would never mail it. The first 3 days were uneventful. The convoy moved in its standard formation, columns of ships spread across several miles of ocean, the escorts prowling the perimeter like nervous sheepdogs. The weather was cold but clear. Visibility was good, too good, perhaps. In these waters, you didn't want to be too visible. On January 18, the convoy encountered its first U-boat. The German submarine U-456 spotted the convoy at dawn and radioed its position to U-boat headquarters in France. Within hours, a wolf pack was forming, 8 submarines converging on convoy SC-118. The attacks began that night. Torpedoes streaked through the dark water. The first ship hit was the cargo vessel Harmonic, near the front of the convoy. She went down in 14 minutes, her back broken by a single torpedo. Then the tanker Robert E. Hopkins exploded in a fireball that lit up the night sky for miles. Men on other ships watched in horror as their comrades burned. The escorts sprang into action, dropping depth charges, firing star shells to illuminate the attacking submarines. It was chaos, organized chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Ships scattered, reformed, scattered again. Radio traffic filled with urgent voices, coordinates, warnings. In the confusion, convoy discipline began to break down, and somewhere in that chaos, on the night of January 18, the 5 ships of Section Charlie received orders to break off from the main convoy and proceed independently to a rendezvous point 200 miles northeast. This was standard procedure when a convoy came under heavy attack: scatter the targets, confuse the enemy, reform later. At 0300 hours on January 19, the Northern Star, Westwood, Manchester Belle, Atlantic Dream, and Maple Providence turned away from the battle and headed into the darkness. The last radio contact from any of these vessels came at 0342 hours, a brief transmission from the Northern Star reporting their position and confirming they were proceeding as ordered. And then, silence. The main convoy fought through 2 more days of attacks. By the time they reached British waters on January 25, they had lost 13 ships. It was considered a costly crossing, but not unusual for those dark days of the Battle of the Atlantic. The escorts had sunk 3 U-boats. Both sides claimed victory. But when the survivors reached port and the Admiralty began its accounting, something troubling emerged. 5 ships were missing, but not among the confirmed sinkings. The 5 vessels of Section Charlie had simply disappeared. No distress calls after that final transmission. No wreckage found. No survivors picked up by other ships or washing ashore in lifeboats. No U-boat commanders claiming kills. Nothing. The Admiralty launched an investigation. They questioned the surviving convoy commanders, reviewed radio logs, studied the last known positions. They contacted U-boat headquarters through intelligence channels after the war ended, trying to determine if German submarines had sunk the ships without reporting it. Nothing matched. Every U-boat in that area during those dates had accounted for its torpedoes and reported its kills. The numbers didn't add up. If U-boats had sunk those 5 ships, the German Navy had no record of it. Could it have been a storm? The Weather Bureau was consulted. Yes, there had been rough weather in that area on January 19th and 20th. A fast-moving gale with high winds and heavy seas. But storms don't usually sink 5 ships simultaneously without any of them managing to send an SOS. The radio operator on even a sinking ship typically has time to tap out a distress signal. Ships don't just vanish in storms, they fight, they call for help, they launch lifeboats. Someone survives. Wreckage washes up. From the ghost convoy, there was nothing. It was as if the 5 ships had sailed into a void and simply ceased to exist. The families of the lost men demanded answers. 217 families wanting to know what happened to their sons, husbands, fathers, brothers. The Admiralty had no answers to give them. The official conclusion, delivered in bureaucratic language that provided no comfort, was simply, lost at sea, cause unknown. But the investigation didn't really stop. It just went quiet. Behind closed doors, in offices at the Admiralty and later at the Ministry of Defense, analysts continued to puzzle over the ghost convoy. Because this kind of thing, 5 ships vanishing completely, it simply didn't happen. Not in the modern age. Not with radios. Not without some trace. Let me tell you about the theories that emerged over the years. Some plausible, some wild, all of them trying to explain the inexplicable. Theory 1. Secret German weapon. This was popular in the immediate post-war years. The idea was that Germany had developed some kind of advanced weapon that could sink ships without leaving evidence. Maybe a new type of torpedo. Maybe something else. When the Allies captured German naval records at the end of the war, they looked for evidence of such weapons. They found programs developing acoustic torpedoes, even primitive guided missiles. But nothing that could explain the ghost convoy. And again, if Germany had used such a weapon, why wouldn't they talk about it? Why no records? Theory 2, friendly fire. This one's darker. The suggestion is that the ships were accidentally sunk by Allied forces, maybe bombers that mistook them for enemy vessels, or a submarine from a neutral country that panicked. The embarrassment would explain why records were sealed. But this theory has problems too. 5 ships, and no one noticed? No pilots filing reports about sinking vessels? No physical evidence? Theory 3, mutiny and piracy. Now we're getting into more speculative territory. The idea here is that the crews of these ships, possibly in collusion, decided to steal the valuable cargo and disappear. They could have sailed to a neutral port, scuttled the ships, and vanished with the goods. But this requires an enormous conspiracy involving over 200 men. And what about the cargo? Much of it, steel, machinery, ammunition, wasn't exactly easy to sell on the black market. And again, someone would have talked eventually. Theory 4, methane blowout. This is where we get into the more exotic explanations. Some scientists have suggested that pockets of methane gas can erupt from the ocean floor, particularly in certain areas of the Atlantic. A massive release of methane could theoretically cause a ship to sink rapidly by reducing the water's density. The ship would drop like a stone, with no time for distress calls. Multiple ships in close proximity could all be affected. It's scientifically possible, but unprecedented for 5 ships simultaneously. Theory 5. The rogue wave. A single massive wave, 100 feet tall, rising out of nowhere and smashing all 5 ships in quick succession. Rogue waves are real. We have satellite data proving their existence. They're rare but documented. Could one have destroyed the convoy? Maybe, but 5 ships spread over several miles? All at once? The mathematics become very unlikely. And then there's Theory 6, the one nobody wants to say out loud in official circles, but that persists in maritime folklore. The supernatural explanation. The Bermuda Triangle crowd loves this one. Ships passing into another dimension. Alien abduction. Sea monsters. Time portals. Look, I'm a researcher, not a mystic. I deal in evidence. But I'll admit this. When conventional explanations all fail, people reach for unconventional ones. And the ghost convoy has defeated conventional explanation for 80 years. In 1967, something unexpected happened. A Soviet fishing trawler operating in the North Atlantic snagged something in its nets, a ship's bell, heavily corroded but still bearing an inscription. The bell came from the SS Northern Star. The location where the bell was found was approximately 400 miles from the last reported position of the ghost convoy. The ocean depth there is over 2 miles. The Soviet captain reported the find, and through diplomatic channels, the bell eventually made its way to Britain and was identified. This should have been the breakthrough. Finally, a location. The Admiralty could send down research vessels, locate the wreck, determine what happened. But here's where the story gets stranger. The coordinates provided by the Soviet captain were vague, deliberately so, according to some sources, because Soviets were operating in waters where they weren't supposed to be. The exact location of the bell discovery was never precisely confirmed. Multiple expeditions over the following decades have searched the general area. They've found wrecks. The Atlantic floor is littered with them. But they've never definitively located any of the 5 ships from the ghost convoy. In 1982, a British research submarine exploring deep water trenches captured sonar images of what appeared to be a large vessel sitting upright on the ocean floor in approximately the right area. The image quality was poor, and the submarine didn't have the capability to retrieve artifacts or confirm the identity. When they tried to return to the same location a year later with better equipment, they couldn't find the wreck again. Ocean currents shift sand, wrecks get buried, or maybe they just got the coordinates wrong. In 1995, an American oil exploration company conducting seabed surveys reported an anomaly, a cluster of metallic objects in a relatively small area, consistent with multiple ships. But before they could investigate further, their contract ended and the data was archived. When researchers tried to access it years later, much of the survey data had been corrupted or lost. It's frustrating. We live in an age where we can see to the edge of the universe, but we still can't definitively locate 5 large metal ships that sank only 80 years ago in a relatively well-traveled part of the ocean. Let me tell you about some of the men who vanished that night. Because these weren't just ships. These were communities, floating cities of men who lived and worked together in some of the most dangerous conditions imaginable. There was First Officer James Parker of the Manchester Belle, 28 years old, from a family of sailors in Maine. His grandfather had sailed on clipper ships around Cape Horn. His father had served in the Merchant Marine in the First World War. James was carrying on the tradition. He'd survived 2 previous sinkings and had decided to make one more crossing before taking a desk job with a shipping company in Boston. His fiancée was waiting for him. They were supposed to marry in March. Radio operator Tommy Chen of the Northern Star. Second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco. 22 years old, he'd learned Morse code from his father, who'd worked for the railroad. Tommy was fast, precise, disciplined. His captain trusted him completely. If any ship had time to send a distress signal, the Northern Star did. And if the Northern Star had time, Tommy would have sent that signal. The fact that he didn't haunts every analysis of this case. Chief Steward Robert Mackenzie of the Maple Providence. 54 years old, Canadian, from Nova Scotia. This was his 63rd Atlantic crossing. 63 times across and back. He knew these waters like some men know their own gardens. Old sailors like Mackenzie don't panic. They don't make mistakes. If something was happening to his ship, Mackenzie would have known what to do. And yet he couldn't save his vessel or himself. Young Danny Ferraro, galley assistant on the Atlantic Dream. 17 years old, though he'd lied and said he was 18 to get the job. From Brooklyn. Wanted to see the world. His mother had begged him not to go. Some part of her knew. Mothers always know. Danny had written her a letter from New York before departing, telling her not to worry, telling her he'd bring her back something nice from England. Maybe a scarf. That letter, like Tom Bradley's, was found in his bunk after the ship was listed as missing. 217 men. 217 stories. Each one ending in the same dark silence. The families never got closure. Some of them held out hope for years. Maybe the ships had been captured by Germans, maybe their men were prisoners, maybe they'd show up when the war ended. But the war ended and no one came home. The Merchant Navy held memorial services. Names were added to monuments. Widows applied for death certificates. Life moved on, as it always does, but the questions remained. In the years since World War II, maritime archaeology has made tremendous advances. We've located the Titanic. We've found ancient Roman vessels. We've mapped vast areas of the ocean floor. But the ghost convoy remains elusive. Some researchers believe the ships are in a deep ocean trench, beyond the reach of most exploration equipment. The Puerto Rico Trench, for instance, plunges to depths of over 5 miles. If the ships somehow ended up there, they might never be found. Others think the wrecks have been located multiple times, but misidentified. The Atlantic has thousands of wrecks. Unless you can bring up an artifact with a name on it, identification is difficult. That ship on the sonar might be the Northern Star, or it might be one of the hundreds of other vessels sunk in those waters. There's also the possibility that the official last position was wrong. If the ships deviated from their course, because of the storm, because of submarine contacts, because of navigation errors, they could be hundreds of miles from where anyone's looking. In 2008, the Ministry of Defense declassified a substantial portion of the ghost convoy file. Researchers eagerly dove into the documents, hoping for revelation. What they found was inconclusive. Radio logs, weather reports, witness statements, lists of cargo, personnel files, all the bureaucratic paperwork of a naval investigation. But no smoking gun, no hidden explanation. Although there was one curious detail. In the margins of one report, someone, the handwriting was never identified, had written a note. Recommend permanent classification. National security implications. What national security implications could a ship sinking in 1943 possibly have in 1946, when that note was written? And why would those implications persist into the modern era? Some documents remain classified, not many, but some. The government's position is that they contain information about naval tactics and signal codes that, while outdated, could still theoretically be useful to adversaries. Most researchers think that's nonsense. Those codes have been obsolete for 70 years. What could they possibly be hiding? Let me share with you one of the strangest aspects of this case. The survivors from the main convoy, the men who watched Section Charlie break off and head into the darkness, many of them reported something odd. An atmospheric phenomenon, they called it. Lieutenant David Morrison, serving on the destroyer HMS Vanoc, one of the escort vessels, filed a report about unusual lights in the sky on the night of January 18. Green and white lights, pulsating, moving against the wind. He thought at first it might be flares from a sinking ship, but the pattern was wrong. The lights appeared to be at high altitude, moving in formation. Several other observers reported similar phenomena. The official explanation was the aurora borealis, the northern lights, which can occasionally be seen at those latitudes. But Morrison and the others insisted these lights were different, more localized, more structured. It's a curious detail. It might be completely unrelated to the ghost convoy's disappearance. Sailors in wartime see all sorts of things: stress, lack of sleep, fear. They all play tricks on the mind. But it's part of the puzzle, part of the strange tapestry of that night. After the war, some of the U-boat commanders were interviewed. Most were eager to talk about their victories. It was a matter of professional pride. But a few were reluctant to discuss the area where the ghost sea.